In 1932, a man named Abdulaziz ibn Saud stitched together a patchwork of desert tribes and declared a new kingdom named after his own family. Nobody in that kingdom could have imagined that 90 years later, women would be racing sports cars through the same deserts, international pop stars would be performing to mixed gender crowds in Riyadh, and a crown prince would be telling the world on camera that the rules everyone assumed were eternal were never actually written down at all. This is the story of how one of the most closed societies on earth quietly rewrote almost everything it believed about sex, marriage, gender, and desire, not once, but twice in less than a century. And the strangest part of this story is not how conservative Saudi Arabia became. It is how open it once was, how suddenly that openness was crushed in the span of 2 violent weeks, and how it is now being unlocked again under conditions almost nobody predicted. Stick with this from the beginning, because the middle of this story involves a siege at the holiest site in Islam that reshaped the private, intimate lives of millions of people who had absolutely nothing to do with it. And the ending involves a legal system that still cannot decide how much freedom it actually wants to allow. When the kingdom was founded, there was no single written law governing sex, marriage, or gender roles at all. Everything ran on unwritten tribal custom, filtered loosely through Islamic scholars, and the two did not always agree with each other. Marriages were arranged through family negotiation, frequently between first cousins to keep wealth and land inside the extended family, with very young brides common in many rural and Bedouin communities, a norm rooted far more in tribal economics and alliance building than in any specific religious mandate. Polygamy was widespread among the wealthy and practiced openly by the royal family itself, with Ibn Saud fathering dozens of children through more than a dozen wives across his lifetime. Each marriage often functioning as a political alliance, stitching together a rival tribe or region into the new kingdom. Divorce was almost entirely a male privilege in practice, obtainable through a simple verbal declaration, while women had little meaningful legal standing to end a marriage on their own initiative. And here's the detail almost nobody brings up when they talk about the founding of Saudi Arabia. Slavery, including the ownership of concubines, remained fully legal in the kingdom until 1962, meaning that for 3 full decades after the country's founding, sexual relationships between owners and enslaved women existed inside a legal gray zone that modern Saudi textbooks rarely mention at all. Slavery's abolition in 1962 came only after sustained pressure from the international community, and it marked one of the first moments where an outside global standard forced a change onto something Saudi Arabia had treated as an internal, private matter. It would not be the last time that pattern repeated itself, but abolition on paper did not mean liberal reform was coming next. Quite the opposite happened in the decades that immediately followed, at least on the surface. Yet underneath that surface, in the growing cities fueled by oil wealth, something far more permissive than most people today would ever guess was quietly taking shape. And it is the part of this history that gets erased from the story most often. By the 1960s, and especially the 1970s, Saudi Arabia's cities were changing in ways that would shock most people who only know the country's recent reputation. Oil wealth was pouring in, and with it came foreign engineers, international schools, and a genuinely cosmopolitan streak in coastal cities like Jeddah. Photographs from that decade, now widely circulated online precisely because they contradict everything people assume, show Saudi women in Western-style clothing without headscarves, walking through mixed-gender cafes, swimming at hotel pools alongside men, and attending university lectures in knee-length skirts. The abaya existed as a traditional garment, but for many urban, educated women, it was a personal choice rather than a legal requirement enforced by the state. Cinemas operated openly in major cities, screening both regional productions and Hollywood films to mixed audiences. Music shops filled the markets, selling records freely. It was never liberal by global 1970s standards, but it was a society visibly loosening its grip on private and sexual life, generation by generation, the way much of the developing world was at the time. Then, in November 1979, in the span of exactly 2 weeks, all of it reversed for reasons that had almost nothing to do with sex and everything to do with fear. A radical preacher named Juhayman al-Otaibi led several hundred armed followers to seize the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the single holiest site in all of Islam, taking hundreds of pilgrims hostage inside its walls and declaring that one of his own followers was the Mahdi, the prophesied redeemer of Islam arriving to announce the end of days. It took Saudi special forces, assisted by Pakistani troops and French commandos, using a non-lethal gas to clear the mosque's underground corridors. Nearly 2 full weeks of brutal fighting to retake the site. By the time it was over, well over 100 people were dead, and dozens of the surviving militants were later publicly executed in cities across the kingdom. The ruling house of Saud emerged from the crisis genuinely terrified, not primarily of the militants themselves, but of what the uprising had revealed, that a meaningful portion of the population believed the monarchy had drifted too far toward Western permissiveness and away from religious purity. King Khalid's response was not to crack down on that extremist ideology. It was to adopt large pieces of it as official state policy. Almost overnight, photographs of women vanished from newspapers and then from television broadcasts entirely. Cinemas across the kingdom were shuttered, some for the next 35 years. Music shops closed their doors under religious pressure. School curricula were rewritten to prioritize hours of religious instruction over subjects like non-Islamic history. And gender segregation, once a loose social custom concentrated mainly in wealthier or more traditional neighborhoods, was suddenly extended by policy into every corner of public life, down to what one historical account specifically described as the humblest coffee shop in the smallest provincial town. The religious police, formerly known as the Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, gained sweeping new authority to physically enforce all of it, patrolling malls, streets, and public buildings, to police dress, mixing between men and women, and prayer attendance. A single act of religious extremism, carried out by a few hundred armed men inside one building, had just rewritten the sexual and social contract for an entire generation of Saudi citizens who would not even be born for another decade. What followed was roughly 4 decades of what became one of the most rigid gender systems anywhere on the planet, built on a legal structure known as the guardianship system, or wilaya. Under this system, every Saudi woman, regardless of her age, education, or professional standing, was placed under the legal authority of a male relative, typically a father, a husband, a brother, and in some documented cases, even her own adult son. A woman needed her guardian's written consent to travel abroad, to obtain a passport, to marry, to accept certain jobs, to undergo specific medical procedures, and in day-to-day practice, often simply to access basic government services at all. This was never one formal written statute that could simply be repealed. It was an accumulated web of administrative practice, religious rulings, and enforced custom, which made it maddeningly difficult to challenge because there was no single law on the books to overturn in one motion. Public space became strictly divided by gender almost everywhere, from separate restaurant seating sections to university buildings to bank branches that sometimes maintained entirely separate entrances, staff, and hours for men and women. Same-sex relationships, meanwhile, fell under an even harsher legal net during the same period, and largely still do today. Because Saudi law criminalizes all sexual activity outside of marriage under uncodified Sharia principles, and because Saudi Arabia has never recognized same-sex marriage in any form, homosexual conduct became automatically and severely criminalized by definition, with documented penalties ranging from flogging to lengthy imprisonment of indeterminate length, up to the death penalty in the most extreme applications of the law, historically applied more often to married men in cases treated as aggravated. Transgender identity fared no better. Saudi Arabia legalized sterilization procedures in 1985, which had the unintended side effect of legalizing sex reassignment surgery as a medical category. Yet the country has continued to criminalize gender expression that does not conform to a person's legal sex, meaning trans Saudis have historically faced prosecution simply for how they dress in public. There was no legal concept of casual dating. There was no legal concept of an unmarried couple sharing a hotel room, or in many interpretations, even a public bench. For 4 decades, this was simply what Saudi private life meant, full stop, no negotiation. But the same oil wealth that had funded the brief 1970s opening was quietly building the exact conditions for a second one, and almost nobody could see it, coming from the direction it actually arrived. Underneath all these official restrictions, ordinary Saudis found their own workarounds, because they always do. During the strictest decades, young men and women who wanted any form of contact outside of arranged introductions turned to what became known locally as the Bluetooth dating scene, discreetly sharing phone numbers through anonymous Bluetooth device names while sitting in the same shopping mall food court, since sitting together openly or exchanging a note by hand risked drawing the attention of the religious police. Mobile phone numbers scrawled on slips of paper were passed hand to hand between segregated sections of restaurants. Later, as smartphones spread, apps like WhatsApp and Snapchat became the quiet infrastructure of an entire underground courtship culture that the law pretended did not exist. Matchmaking through female relatives remained the dominant socially accepted path to marriage for most families, with mothers and aunts often doing the actual vetting of a potential match long before 2 young people ever met face to face, sometimes only formally meeting for the first time at their own engagement ceremony. None of this was unique to Saudi Arabia among conservative societies, but the scale of the gap between official law and everyday lived behavior became one of the defining, quietly acknowledged features of Saudi social life for an entire generation, and it is part of why the reforms after 2017 landed as fast as they did. The private behavior had already been changing for years, waiting for the law to finally catch up to it. The unlikely seed of that second opening was education, and it started under King Abdullah, who ruled from 2005 to 2015. His government poured enormous resources into schooling for girls and young women, building Princess Noura bint Abdulrahman University in Riyadh, which became the single largest women's university on the planet, and launching the King Abdullah Scholarship Program, which sent well over 100,000 young Saudis, including tens of thousands of young women, abroad to study in the United States, the United Kingdom, and across Europe. It was framed publicly and genuinely intended as an economic investment, a way to diversify a workforce dangerously dependent on oil revenue. In 2013, King Abdullah appointed 30 women to the Shura Council, the country's top consultative body, for the very first time in its history. In 2015, Saudi women were permitted to vote and run as candidates in municipal elections for the first time ever. What none of these individual policies fully accounted for was their combined effect. They produced an entire generation of young Saudi women who had lived, studied, or worked inside societies without guardianship laws, without mandatory segregation, and without any legal ban on driving. They came home changed, and their personal expectations rose right along with them, even while the driving ban itself stayed firmly in place, even while the religious police still patrolled the malls, even while the guardianship system still shaped the basic architecture of a woman's entire adult life. A quiet pressure was building underneath the surface of Saudi society for years, and in 2017 it finally found a release valve almost nobody had predicted. A 32-year-old crown prince with a sweeping economic plan and remarkably little patience for the old religious order that had ruled since 1979. Mohammed bin Salman, known globally by his initials MBS, became crown prince in June 2017, and within months he launched a wave of social reform that moved faster than almost any comparable shift in modern Middle Eastern history. The General Entertainment Authority had already been created in 2016 to begin sponsoring concerts and public events, a small but telling sign of what was coming. In September 2017, a royal decree ended the world's only remaining ban on women driving, effective the following June, a change so symbolically loaded that news of it dominated global headlines for days. The next month, women were permitted into sports stadiums for the first time in the kingdom's history. By early 2018, commercial cinemas reopened after a 35-year absence, with the government projecting hundreds of new movie theaters and thousands of screens nationwide by 2030. International concerts began appearing on Saudi soil, something that would have triggered a religious backlash a decade earlier. This entire wave was framed under the banner of Vision 2030, MBS's plan to diversify the economy away from oil dependence and make the kingdom an attractive destination for global investment and tourism. But its social side effects reached directly into the most private corners of ordinary Saudi life in ways an economic plan rarely does. In 2019, the guardianship system absorbed its biggest single blow yet. Women over the age of 21 gained the right to apply for their own passports and travel internationally without a male guardian's permission, to independently register their own marriages, divorces, and children's births, and, in certain circumstances, to be legally recognized as their own children's guardian. That same year, the rules around unmarried couples sharing hotel rooms, long treated as a serious moral and legal boundary in Saudi society, were quietly relaxed specifically for foreign visitors, allowing international tourists to check in together, showing nothing more than a passport, no marriage certificate required. Saudi women, including citizens, simultaneously gained the right to rent a hotel room entirely alone for the first time in the kingdom's history, using only their own identification. Saudi nationals in mixed-gender pairs, however, still needed to show proof of a family relationship to share a room. A small but telling reminder that reform in Saudi Arabia has consistently arrived in layers, moving faster for the outside world watching in than for the citizens actually living inside it. The same year brought the launch of the tourist e-visa program, opening the kingdom to non-Muslim international visitors for the very first time in its modern history, a decision that would reshape the entire economy of Saudi social life within just a few years. Then came a deeper legal shift that almost nobody outside legal and human rights circles noticed at the time it happened. In March 2022, on International Women's Day specifically, Saudi Arabia passed its very first codified personal status law, ending a system where family matters like marriage, divorce, and child custody had been left almost entirely to the individual interpretation of male judges, applying uncodified Sharia principles case by case, with wildly inconsistent outcomes depending on which judge a woman happened to draw. For the first time in the kingdom's 90-year history, there was an actual written legal text governing these relationships, with more clearly defined protections around a woman's right to seek divorce and more explicit rules around consent to marriage. It was not full legal equality by any measure. Male guardians still had to formally consent to a woman's marriage contract for it to be considered legally valid, and human rights groups pointed out that codifying certain guardianship elements arguably lock those restrictions permanently into written law rather than removing them, since custom is far easier to quietly ignore than a printed statute. But the symbolic weight of the change was enormous. The most private, sexual, and marital dimensions of Saudi citizens' lives were, for the very first time in the country's modern existence, being governed by something an ordinary citizen could actually sit down and read for themselves. By the mid-2020s, the transformation had become almost unrecognizable against the country's own recent past. Riyadh season grew into a 6-month multi-zone entertainment mega-festival spread across 11 separate districts, drawing millions of domestic and international visitors every year. The tourist e-visa program brought in an estimated 122 million visitors in 2025 alone, blowing past the government's original target years ahead of schedule. Former religious police officers, speaking anonymously to journalists covering the transition, described their old institution as essentially hollowed out from within, admitting they no longer held any real legal authority to stop women over dress code violations or to enforce mixed gender separation inside restaurants and cafes, and that those who remained on the payroll mostly stayed for the salary rather than any remaining sense of religious mission. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself stated publicly on more than one occasion that the black abaya was never actually a strict religious requirement at all, only a matter of modest and respectful dress, ultimately left to each woman's own personal choice. A claim that would have been almost unthinkable to say out loud inside the kingdom just 15 years earlier, when women were being formally detained for removing it in public. It is also worth being precise about how far the dress code shift has actually gone, because a wave of viral social media claims in 2025 exaggerated it into something it was not. Fact-checkers looking into a widely shared claim that MBS had announced women could now wear absolutely anything they wanted found no verifiable government statement supporting that specific claim, and human rights researchers documented that many clothing designs remained informally restricted even as enforcement collapsed. What actually changed was narrower and more precise than the viral version. The abaya and headscarf stopped being a strictly enforced legal requirement, particularly for foreign visitors, and the old rigid uniformity gave way to a broader, less specific standard of modest dress, covering shoulders and knees, enforced loosely by ordinary police rather than a dedicated religious force, under what the government now calls a public decorum code rather than a religious dress law. For Saudi women themselves, the abaya remains a common cultural garment, increasingly available in colors beyond black, or now more as a matter of heritage and personal identity than as a legal obligation backed by the threat of arrest. That distinction between a right that technically exists on paper and a norm that people still feel real social pressure to follow runs through almost every reform in this story. And it is exactly why outside observers and Saudi citizens themselves so often disagree about how much has genuinely changed. And yet, alongside every one of these dramatic changes, some of the oldest boundaries in Saudi society have not moved at all. And this is the part most headline coverage conveniently leaves out. Sex outside of marriage remains a criminal offense under Sharia law for both citizens and residents. Same-sex relationships remain fully criminalized on paper, with the same theoretical range of penalties from flogging to imprisonment to the death penalty still technically written into the legal framework, even as visible enforcement against foreign tourists has become far less common than enforcement historically directed at citizens and residents. Unmarried Saudi couples, unlike foreign tourists checking into the same hotel, still cannot legally share a room together without proof of a family relationship. The guardianship system has been dismantled in large, visible pieces, but not abolished as a legal structure in its entirety. And a male guardian's consent still governs the validity of a woman's marriage contract under the new personal status law itself. Reform in Saudi Arabia has never actually meant a clean, straight line running from restriction toward freedom. It has meant one government deciding, twice now in less than a century, exactly how much control it is willing to hold over its citizens' most private and intimate lives, and exactly how fast that control can be loosened without triggering the very same kind of religious backlash that shut the entire country down in 1979. There is one more twist in this story that most retrospectives leave out entirely, and it is the part that complicates any simple narrative of steady progress. In the same months that the driving ban was actually lifted in 2018, several of the very women's rights activists who had spent years publicly campaigning for that exact right were arrested and detained, with some later reporting allegations of mistreatment while in custody. Human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have consistently noted that Saudi Arabia's social reforms arrived without any comparable expansion of political freedom, meaning citizens gained new personal liberties around dress, driving, and travel at the exact same time that public criticism of the reforms themselves, or of the men delivering them, became more dangerous rather than less. The message underneath the message was unmistakable. Freedom in the new Saudi Arabia would be granted from above on the government's own timeline and never successfully demanded from below. That single fact shapes how many ordinary Saudis actually talk about these changes in private. with genuine appreciation for the new freedoms sitting uneasily alongside a clear understanding of exactly who is still allowed to decide how far those freedoms extend and how quickly they could theoretically be pulled back if the political winds shifted again the way they did so abruptly in 1979. So where does that actually leave things in 2026? A kingdom that once banned photographs of women from its own newspapers now hosts Formula One races, sold-out international concerts, and a genuinely growing domestic film industry featuring Saudi actresses appearing on camera by name. A kingdom that once required a male guardian's written signature before a woman could leave the country now has women driving commercial trucks, flying passenger jets, and founding their own registered businesses without asking a single relative's permission first. And yet that exact same legal system still treats an unmarried Saudi couple holding hands in a public park, or a same-sex relationship conducted anywhere inside the country's borders, as a potential criminal offense carrying real, documented penalties. The history of Saudi sexuality was never really a slow, steady story about desert tribes gradually modernizing at their own comfortable pace. It is a much sharper story about how quickly an entire society's most intimate private rules can be rewritten from the very top, in either direction, whenever the small handful of people holding power decide the moment finally calls for it. The only question left worth asking is which direction the next rewrite goes, and after watching exactly what happened in 1979, and exactly what has happened since 2017, almost nobody inside Saudi Arabia today is willing to guess that answer with much confidence at all,